Today I want to start with a sort of overview of where we are and where Sellars is at this stage in his career, and then go back to talk about where he leaves us with the treatment of modality. And then I'm going to veer off and not so much talk about Sellars as talk about what I think can be done with the view of modality that he has. And I'll come back around to him again at the end, I think. And I should say about the things I'll say sort of for a next stage in thinking about modality. Some of them I think I have reasonably clear ideas about. By the very end, by the time we get to the picture on the handout, it gets less clear. But I still want to share the ideas with you. So it seems to me we've seen 4 big transformative essays and ideas in Sellars so far. Just in the 6 years between 51 and 57, some reflections on language games, the inference and meaning, empiricism and the philosophy of mind, and this counterfactuals, dispositions, and the causal modalities. So the first one, he has a different way of thinking about pragmatics, or the use of the language. You know, the distinction between the language entry transitions, the language moves, and the language exit transitions, thinking about these as rule-governed. It may not seem like that's path-breaking work, but when we see what he does with those ideas, I think it really is. And you also have to remember he's doing this essentially contemporaneously with Wittgenstein's investigations, with which it bears obvious affinities. And then he has a new idea in semantics, in inference and meaning, to think about inferential roles rather than just extensions. And he thinks that this is going to give him a broader picture. Remember the autobiographical sketch in which he says that already when he was in graduate school, he had the idea that if you wanted to understand modal vocabulary, it was hopeless to think of it in empiricist terms of sort of what feature of experience it was describing or reflecting. You needed to think more broadly in terms of what inferential role these expressions played. And that's something that 20 years later comes to some sort of fruition in CDCM. But if we think about the semantic idea, rule-governed normative transitions into, within, and out of the space of reasons in SRLG, and this inferential role notion of what it is to be conceptually contentful in a broad sense from IM, really those are the 2 things he puts together to add up to a critique of givenness in the first half of EPM. Language entry transitions, he's thinking, have to be, and so non-inferential reports that are the result of those transitions have to be conceptually contentful, because they have to play, according to his inferentialist semantic idea, they have to play an inferential role, to be contentful, to be able to serve as the premises of inferences. They have to have a full inferential role. And on that basis, he's going to say they don't form a semantically autonomous stratum of the language because they don't form a pragmatically autonomous stratum of the language. And that's true no matter what you're reporting, whether you're reporting objective empirical states of affairs or the contents of your own mind. What we were talking about last time is that once you appreciate that in order to be able to non-inferentially be aware of anything, you have to already be able to make all the different kinds of moves in a language game in particular the language moves in it. Then we see that though it rules out a certain kind of epistemological foundationalism, anything that assumes the semantic autonomy of the foundation, it leaves you room for a sanitized or hygienic version of empiricism in epistemology that appreciates the special and crucial role that non-inferential reports play. Without them, we wouldn't have any empirical knowledge. And as he says, in some sense, they are the ultimate court of appeal when we have disagreements about empirical matters. Again, he adds one more idea in the second half of EPM. This is an idea from the philosophy of mind and from the philosophy, it's an idea from the philosophy of science that he applies to the philosophy of mind. And the idea in the philosophy of science is that the distinction between observable things and theoretical things is methodological rather than ontological. They're not different kinds of things, they're just things that are related to us epistemically in different ways. Theoretical things we can only, at this stage in the development of our discursive practices, find out about inferentially, whereas observable things we can find out about either inferentially or, if things go our way, observationally, if we're in the right place at the right time, and so on. And on this basis, he comes up with a new form of behaviorism, methodological behaviorism, that says mental talk is to behavioral talk as theoretical talk is to observational talk. That the point of talking about our minds is to make sense of behavior. That's what was right about traditional behavior. But it doesn't mean we have to do it just in terms of observable behavior. We can also postulate things that, to begin with, are only inferentially accessible, are theoretical entities. And he has this nice story about how things that are introduced as purely theoretical can come to play an observational role, can come to have an observable use. Now, all those ideas, I think, are not particularly Kantian. Really what he's doing with that constellation of ideas, which I remind you has brought him a long way by the end of EPM, is cleaning up 20th century empiricism, logical empiricism, in a sort of pragmatist spirit, by thinking about what you have to do in order to use expressions with certain meanings. But the next idea really is Kantian. It's the Kantian idea of the categories, that besides concepts whose principal expressive role it is to describe and explain empirical goings-on, there's concepts that play a different expressive role, the expressive role of making explicit features of the framework that makes it possible to describe and explain. And he gives this a metalinguistic twist. This is the lesson he learned from Carnap. And I say the lesson he learned from Carnap because it wasn't the way Carnap put it or thought about it. It was Sellars who saw that Carnap's use of a category of metalinguistic expressions, expressions whose job it was to talk about talking in one way or another, was a recognizable, to Sellars, version of that Kantian idea of categories or pure concepts of the understanding. And in particular, he thought that was the way we should think about modal expressions, that their expressive role was to make explicit rules for using ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. So that builds on the inferential semantics of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary and Kant's categorical idea and Carnap's metalinguistic twist, so that when Sellars becomes enamored of what he called the new way of words around the middle of the century, it was because he saw the prospect in Carnap's use of metalinguistic expressions, and as it were his meta-meta story about the significance of meta-languages, a way to combine Kantian insights with a cleaned up version of empiricism. And this is a strategy that we'll see him use for other things. Starting next week, we're going to look at what he makes of Carnap's metalinguistic understanding of talk about universals, about propositions, and about abstract objects generally. Now, in CDCM, Sellars offers, I think, a telling diagnosis of what's wrong with what he, in a happy phrase, calls empiricism's nothing but isms of every description. And here he means emotivism about normative vocabulary and the skepticism that even logical empiricists had about modal vocabulary. The idea that unless you could assimilate the use of some expressions to the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, there was something defective about it. So normative vocabulary didn't seem to work that way. Modal vocabulary didn't seem to work that way. And so you say, well, there's really nothing but dispositions in the case of norms, or habits of mind in the case of modal vocabulary. But he says there's really two sources, he thinks, of this. One is global descriptivism, thinking that the only sort of expressive role that's available for things to play that is acceptable to empiricists is a descriptive role. And he thinks that Carnap has shown the way beyond that by endorsing the notion of metalinguistic expressions as okay. But he also thinks that a recoil from abstract objects, that thinks of them as ontologically extravagant, because epistemologically inaccessible. If you're an empiricist, how is it that we know about numbers or pure sets or properties or propositions, these things that as abstract we can't causally interact with, we don't have empirical experience of. They're epistemologically inaccessible on empiricist grounds, and so ontologically suspect. And Sellars sees the notion of metalinguistic expressions as a joint solution to those two sources of nothing butism in all of its forms. Now, I'll just mention, Wittgenstein goes down a very similar road in the investigations. He's constantly warning us against thinking that just because something has the form of a declarative sentence, that it's playing the expressive role of fact stating, or that just because something is grammatically a singular term or a proper name, that it's playing the expressive role of purporting to pick out an object. So, for instance, he doesn't think expressions like the pain I'm feeling now in my tooth, he doesn't think that that's referring to an object. If you look at the way expressions like that are used, he doesn't think a representational, descriptive picture of how they're working fits for them. So he's also arguing against a Procrustean, one-size-fits-all representational or descriptive model for understanding the use of different kinds of expressions. Where they diverge is that Sellars thinks there's basically one other kind of expressive role that things can play, namely metalinguistic. Now, there are divisions within that, but basically he thinks there's empirical expressions and there's metalinguistic expressions. He's with Garnett on that. So he's a kind of expressive dualist in this regard. Wittgenstein is an expressive pluralist. He thinks there's all kinds of different things, expressive roles that language can play. He says if you think there's only a small number, you're probably thinking of, hammers and nails and screws and screwdrivers, wrenches and bolts. You're not thinking about tool belts and measuring sticks and plumb lines, all of which are performing quite different functions. You're not thinking about the pencil that can be used both to mark the wood before sawing it and to draw the plan for the thing that you're building. And indeed, Wittgenstein thinks that there isn't a definite multiplicity of these functions, that everywhere we look, we'll find a different function, and that the language is a protean set of practices, and that all the time we're adding new expressive roles that things can play. Wittgenstein seems to think that from that pluralism in the pragmatics, a nihilism about semantics follows, that you shouldn't think that it's going to be useful to postulate contents or meanings, sort of unified things associated with expressions, because that's part of an enterprise that then would have to systematically derive proprieties of the use of the expression from the associated meanings. So, although Wittgenstein and Sellars are going along together in many of the same ways, not just in the sort of normative pragmatics of some reflections on language games, but in the critique of descriptivism or representationalism, at a certain point they go in different directions. And the direction that Sellars goes in allows him to be a systematic philosopher in a way that Wittgenstein is not. And I think these are still, that's an important fork in the road of possibilities. Well, let me talk about this sort of last move on modality for a little bit, because I think it's hard for us, particularly for you younger ones, to realize just how astonishing the Modal Revolution was to philosophers who sort of grew up in the 50s and the early 60s, or any time before that in the 20th century. Modality, the notion of necessity and possibility, the lawfulness of laws of nature, was one of the most philosophically puzzling concepts. It was the hardest thing to understand for traditional empiricism, and that was inherited by logical or 20th century empiricism. And it was not just difficult for them. The tradition in the philosophy of mind that Roy Wood-Sellars belonged to was broadly empiricist in its philosophy of mind and its epistemology, couldn't respond to Hume's epistemological challenge about modality. How could we know about these law-like connections if there were such things, and how could we understand them if we don't see how we could know about them? Peirce, in the founding documents of American pragmatism, takes making sense of modal properties, of unactualized possibilities, and of necessities that are more than mere contingent regularities, as perhaps the motivating philosophical challenge of his day, late 19th century, and takes the pragmatist's invocation of habits, both on the part of objective things and on the part of us knowers of them, to be pragmatism's big innovation. It's going to let us think about modality. He talks about how to make sense of the fragility of a diamond that is created in the caldera of a volcano and spends its entire life there until it's melted into carbon, so it's never broken or shattered, nothing ever hits it. But he says, still, we want to say it had this property of fragility. That's a property about what's possible, about what would happen if something that didn't happen had happened. How do we make sense of that? He says, you can't do science without that. None of the extant epistemologies could make sense of that. I mentioned that the Vienna Circle was split into a more empiricist wing led by Schlick and a more naturalist wing led by Neurath. Both of them, all of them were empiricists and naturalists, but when push came to shove and you had to choose between them, which way did you go? Well, what forced the decision was more than anything else modal concepts. If you were a naturalist, you believed in laws of nature. You believed in the kind of facts that are stated by subjunctive conditionals about what acceleration would result if you applied a certain force to this mass. This is absolutely fundamental to the naturalistic picture of the world, and yet the Humean epistemological challenge to these things remained unanswered. So if you were Schlick and cared more about the empiricism, you were skeptical about this essential pillar of naturalism. And if you nonetheless, like Neurath, stayed with the naturalism, well, you were giving up some empiricist claims. You were obviously not so serious an empiricist because there just wasn't a story to be told about this. And Quine, who was certainly the most influential Anglophone philosopher of his generation, seconded this and was very eloquent in his dismissal of the intelligibility of modal notions. Dismissed modal logic, for instance, of his teacher C.I. Lewis as engendering a mere illusion of understanding. He knew it was an illusion because these modal notions were unintelligible on empiricist grounds. Well, think about the people who grew up and lived and moved and had their being in this philosophical environment, which lasted at least into the early 60s. How surprised they would have been to be transported 50 years forward and find out that when contemporary philosophers are puzzled by some phenomenon, by intentional or semantic relations, by normative relations, that absolutely the first place, that the first tool they pull out of their philosophical conceptual toolbox is modal notions, is subjunctive conditionals, is talk about what's possible and what's necessary. What they would want to know changed that made this paradigmatically problematic and puzzling phenomenon suddenly something that we understand so well that it's our go-to notion for understanding the remaining problematic notions in ontology, in philosophy of mind, in epistemology. And I think the Modal Revolution, that's what happened, happened in 4 stages. The first was Kripke's Semantics for modal logic. The modal logics, those systems have been around since C.I. Lewis in the teens. So by the time Kripke is looking at them, they've been around half a century, but they were just axiom chopping, just proof systems. There wasn't a semantics for them the way there was for extensional discourse since the 30s, since Tarski's model theory, a really compelling and powerful semantics for them. But there wasn't for these modal notions, and this was really important to Quine when he's criticizing the mere logic chopping C.I. Lewis modality. He's saying, yeah, but we don't have a semantics for it the way we do for extensional things. And Kripke comes up with this powerful possible world semantics with accessibility relations for all of the Lewis frames and for many other things. I'll just remind you, he was 14 when he did that. He published it in Acta Philosophica Fennica, the Finnish Journal of Philosophy. It was the equivalent in those days of the principle that the good thing about the internet is no one knows you're a dog. They didn't know he was 14, and nobody ever heard of him in the States. They didn't know that much about American philosophers, and he sent them this compelling set of articles, and they just published them. But that, I think, by itself wouldn't have done it. That was the first sort of opening salvo in the Modal Revolution. But the next wave was when Montague, Kaplan, Stalnaker, and David Lewis, other people too, but those are maybe the big figures, showed how to extend Kripke's modal semantics for modal logical vocabulary, it's possible world semantics for modal logical vocabulary, which is still, it's the box and the diamond, basically. That's not a lot of vocabulary. These figures extended it to an intentional semantics for vocabulary generally, for empirical vocabulary in particular. Montague's version of it is particularly flexible and powerful. Suddenly you could do a theory of meaning in general in these terms. It was not just a semantics for logic, it was a semantics to core. In an influential article in 67, I guess, called General Semantics, David Lewis described the sort of mathematical grip on meaning that this possible world semantics gives us. I'll use a different example than he did, but this is one that's near and dear to my heart. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing in philosophy were I not impressed with this particular sort of example, that if we interpret propositions by sets of possible worlds as their semantic interpretant, and interpret singular terms by the objects they refer to in different possible worlds, then that tells us that our interpretant for one-place predicates should be a function from objects to sets of possible worlds. So walks should be that way. Butter's toast should be a function from objects in the world, from objects to the set of worlds in which that object is walking or buttering toast. But now when we notice, now when we think about adverbs, you can walk slowly or butter the toast slowly. Now we see what sort of semantic interpretant we should give to those adverbs. They should be functions from objects to sets of possible worlds to functions from objects to sets of possible worlds. That is, from one-place predicates, walks, to one-place predicates. Walk slowly. Since the interpretant of the one is a function from objects to sets of possible worlds, we just need functions from functions to functions. And when we notice that adverbs come in two flavors, attributive adverbs, where if you phi exly, it follows that you phi, and non-attributive ones, so if you walk slowly, it follows that you walk. If you butter the toast slowly, it follows you buttered the toast. But there's non-attributive ones like in your imagination. If you buttered the toast in your imagination, it doesn't follow that you buttered the toast. In your imagination is a different kind of adverb from in the kitchen, because if you buttered the toast in the kitchen, it does follow. Well, now, when we see that the proper form of a semantic interpretant for an adverb should be a function from objects to sets of possible worlds, to functions from objects to sets of possible worlds, we can now mathematically represent the difference between attributive and non-attributive adverbs. Well, this is an example of the sort of mathematical grip on meanings generally that this apparatus gave us. It really opened up a heaven of understanding of meanings, which, after all, philosophy had been about since Socrates worried about what piety means. But now we had these new tools. This is what Russell had hoped to get from the logic of Principia Mathematica. Well, this was way more powerful. That was the second wave. But Kripke had not been sitting on his hands. In 71, he publishes Naming and Necessity and shows how to use this apparatus in the philosophy of language outside of formal semantics to understand the use of proper names, the use of proper names in a way that we never had done before. And this was the third wave of this modal revolution, to think about the relation between epistemological a priority and a posteriority on the one hand, and analyticity and syntheticity on the other, these classical epistemological conceptions. And then there were two strands, I think, in the fourth wave, the post-naming and necessity wave. One of them was David Lewis picking up the metaphysical strand that Kripke had introduced in Naming and Necessity, the notion of metaphysical possibilities and necessities intimately tied with, and in Lewis's hands, thought of as underlying and explaining semantic features. In Lewis's hands, this was transformed into contemporary analytic metaphysics, which really is downstream from what Lewis made of that. And the second one, interestingly, is another application in semantics of this apparatus, an application independent of the intentional semantics that I said was the second wave of this revolution. And this is a way of thinking about the notion of representation or possession of semantic content, not now in formal semantics, but in philosophical semantics, where philosophical semantics studies how formal semantic interpretants get associated with objects so that we can then build up complicated ones out of simple ones in the way that the account of adverbs does. And this had, in turn, I think, two mainstreams. People like Dretsky and Fodor came to understand representation and, I'll just say representation, the representational semantic features of mental events in terms of their information content, thought of in terms of dispositions for Dretsky, or in picking one of Fodor's many incarnations, his one-way counterfactual dependence account of the relation between horses and horses. That is, between horse representings in us and horses out there. He says, look, if the horses were different, the representations would be different, but that's an asymmetric relation, just us moving the representations around doesn't change the horses. Using the modal locutions, counterfactual conditionals, dispositional locutions that philosophers were newly comfortable with in semantics, in philosophical semantics. And then second, what to my mind is a much more sophisticated application of this material to the same end in teleosemantics, whose most sophisticated practitioner is Ruth Millikan, but David Papineau, Kim Sterelny are also practitioners of this, appealing to these, to what's expressed by these modal locutions, these subjunctive conditionals, to in the philosophy of mind and in semantics to make sense of the representational contents of things. The distinctive idea of teleosemantics is a selectional idea. In this way, they belong in a box with the classical American pragmatists. It's to distinguish extensions from intensions, to distinguish, to understand how systems can treat coextensional properties differently by appealing to subjunctive conditionals in a selectional way. So paradigmatically, suppose you've got a bunch of small black marbles mixed with large white marbles. Then the color and the size, they're coextensive. All and only the black ones are the small ones, all and only the white ones are the large ones. But if you have a sieve, you can appeal to the way the sieve will select them. Well, it'll select all the small black marbles. But if you look at it dispositionally, what would happen if you had a white small marble or a large black marble? You can see that even though it selects for the black color and the small size, it's selecting for the size, not the color, because of this dispositional property about it. So you can see its dispositions, its selectional behavior as distinguishing between these coextensional properties. That's the leading idea, the leading wedge that the teleosemanticists want to leverage into an understanding of meaningfulness generally, how we get our minds around these things. So, fabulous constellation of philosophically progressive ideas, brought forward by whole communities, though there are some sort of isolated geniuses in this. Kripke comes up more than once, Lewis comes up more than once in this, but it was really a community effort. But still we could ask, how did that respond to the epistemological worries that Hume had, that Carnap had, that Quine had? After all, possible world semantics appeals to a modal primitive, possible worlds. And it doesn't have a ready answer as to how we know about other possible worlds. If you're David Lewis and you think of the possible worlds as worlds just like this one, that is, concrete objects, concrete universes that are just causally disconnected from this one, his actual argument for this is an epistemological argument. Well, you can't tell which possible world you're in. You don't know whether you're in the possible world that has, a kitten in the next room or one that doesn't. Surely you'd be able to tell the difference if there were only one of them, the actual world, that was a concrete particular, and the others were some kind of abstract objects. This, I mean, he has more to say than that, but this is the idea behind what he called Mad Dog Modal Realism, to think of these other possible worlds as universes just like this, but causally disconnected from it. But if you say that, okay, how is it we can know about any of them? If they're causally disconnected from us, if you're any kind of an empiricist, how is it that that we can think, so much as think about these things? And yet you're saying that the contents of our thoughts are uncountably infinite sets of these things. Maybe you're Stolnicker and you think, no, I'm not a Mad Dog Modal Realist. These are other ways the actual world could be. They're abstract objects. Well, all right, how are you related to those? How do you know about those things? Now, I'm not saying that there's no way to address these issues. The epistemology of modality is a big topic. What I'm saying is nothing about these four waves of the modal revolution addresses those issues at all. So how is it that this transformation in our attitude toward how puzzling modal things are was so transformed that what was most puzzling came to be the thing that we use to explain other things in teleosemantics setting? Now my teacher, Rorty, drew a cynical, skeptical conclusion from that. He said, well, obviously this is just a matter of fashion. People got tired of worrying about that problem. They had this shiny new box of toys, and they said, let's play with them. And the previous generation, Quine was never convinced by this, said, but you haven't said why you're entitled to. That was the whole question, was the epistemological question. And Rorty said, and people just didn't care anymore. They said, well, yeah, that's a problem, but we're not going to worry about that. We're going to go ahead and do this. And Rorty drew this cynical conclusion, well, they're just fads in philosophy. It's just fashion. It's not rationally driven at all. But if you ask Sellars why these things were respectable, he'd give a Kantian answer. He'd say, it's because what you're expressing with modal vocabulary is necessary features of the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And because it is, in knowing how to use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, you already know how to do everything you need to know how to do in order to understand modal vocabulary. There's a route from your understanding of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary to an understanding of modal vocabulary, because they play this distinctive Kantian categorical role. And this is what I call the Sellars thesis about modality, that the distinctive expressive function of modal vocabulary is to make explicit essential features of the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And therefore, in order to grasp or understand what's expressed by modal vocabulary, you don't need to know how to do anything that you don't already need to know how to do in order to use that ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And here we can think of a progression of, so what I'm saying is, Sellars, before the Modal Revolution, he's writing this essay in 1957, has already given us the form of a at least colorable and arguably convincing response to the empiricist epistemological concerns about modality. He says those concerns depended on you're assuming that modal vocabulary was describing something about the world, your descriptivism, and if it was, then it had to be something sort of abstract. So these twin worries. And he's saying, but it isn't that. Don't think about it at all that way. Both of those are misleading you, making you puzzled for just as a result of the mistake. If you think about them playing this framework explicating role, and so being, thank you, Rudolph, metalinguistic, you won't have these epistemological worries and can be comfortable with them. So I'm claiming that Sellars gives us really the only convincing, the only straw floating, the only convincing rationale for the comfort that went along with the modal revolution, that there really was a response to these empiricist worries. People didn't know that Sellars thought that, and so didn't have an answer to that empiricist challenge, but Sellars did. And we've seen sort of how he softens us up for that. He says, look, if you're describing empirical things, it's got to be more than just labeling them. It's got to be more than just responding differentially to them. The descriptions, the concepts you're applying, you have to be labeling them by applying concepts to them. Well, what is that? Well, at least the concepts have to stand in a space of implications. There have to be circumstances of appropriate application, consequences of appropriate consequences of application. There have to be things they rule out. It's standing in that space that gives them conceptual content. And furthermore, those relations are subjunctively robust. For you to call something a lion or copper, you have to, at least in a practical, rough and ready way, make a distinction between things that follow from its being a lion or being copper, things that would be evidence for or against its being a lion or copper. And those have to support subjunctive reasoning. So you have to know about the lion, that if it's hungry and it saw, a wounded gazelle, that it would chase it. And you have to know that if it were struck by lightning, it wouldn't chase it. Or if not those particular facts, you have to know some things like that about how copper would behave, how the lion would behave. And it's those implications and incompatibilities, material implications and incompatibilities, think of him introducing that category in inference and meaning, because they support subjunctive reasoning, they play a role in explanation. And he says description and explanation, those are explanatory resources that advance hand in hand. Well, because pragmatically those activities go together. If you have practices of describing, that's inseparable from treating one description as a reason for the applicability or against the applicability of another description. So for you to be able to use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, you have to distinguish materially good from materially bad inferences and incompatibilities in a subjunctively robust way. That is, you have to distinguish between what would happen and what wouldn't, even though you're fallible and there may be cases that you just don't know about. But if you don't make distinctions like that, you're not applying a concept. You're not in the space of reasons. And then he says, Well, now suppose you could do all that, but you didn't know how to use any modal vocabulary. You didn't know how to use the subjunctive conditionals that make explicit those proprieties of reasoning. Well, you can already distinguish between subjunctively robust inferences from P to Q that are good and the ones that aren't. Now I tell you, well, if the inference from P to Q is a good one, even if you change around some of the collateral premises, that's what makes it subjunctively robust. That is, the inference from the hungry lion would chase the gazelle. That would still be a good one if today were Thursday instead of Wednesday, and if that beetle on the tree were 2 inches higher on the trunk, and it wouldn't be good if the lion were struck by lightning or crushed by a falling rock. You can already make those distinctions. Well, I tell you, if the inference from P to Q is good in that sense, then you can assert if P then Q, as if P were true, then Q would be true, using subjunctive conditionals. You can say it's necessary that. You can talk about possibilities. You already know how to do everything you need to know how to do to introduce explicit modal vocabulary. He thinks grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word. So all you're missing is the words. All you're missing is the subjunctive conditionals, is the modal operators, because you can already do the things that these assertions serve as licenses for. You just don't have those licenses yet. And if that's right, then there can't be an in-principle epistemological barrier between you and knowing what's expressed by that modal vocabulary. However you find out empirically what are the good implications and what are the real incompatibilities, so find out whether this thing is copper, whether it's a lion or so. That is finding out modal stuff. Those go hand in hand. The Humean predicament of saying, I understand perfectly well how to use non-modal empirical expressions, and it's completely mysterious to me how to use the modal ones, that's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what's involved in understanding perfectly well how to use the descriptive ones. That was Kant's insight, that you couldn't know how to use those ordinary empirical concepts like lion and alive and copper and metal, without knowing how to reason in the way that's made explicit, that's licensed by this modal vocabulary. So Sellars' metalinguistic expressivism about modality gives empiricists a way out, a justification for being comfortable with the use of the modal vocabulary, whose use was articulated in these incredibly intricate and controlled ways by the different phases of the Modal Revolution. So that's where I think Sellars got in CDCM in 1957. What I want to talk about next is what he didn't get. So what the problems are that are left over in that account. I've indicated this before. I think, he says, well, so should we just say these are metalinguistic? And he says, well, you can't really say that. Because it's not the case that all A's are necessarily B's. all samples of pure copper will melt at 1084 degrees C, means the same thing as the inference from applying the term copper to applying the term melts at 1084 degrees C is a good one. It isn't because that fact about copper, what's expressed by the subjunctive conditional, if you melt any sample of pure copper, if you heat it to 1084 degrees C, it will melt. What's expressed by that could be true, even though those English expressions didn't work, didn't exist. Indeed, if no linguistic expressions existed. And I could understand that the inference from the applicability of some Turkish expression to some other Turkish expression was a good inference without knowing what it meant, without knowing that it said every sample of copper would melt at this. So these expressions don't have the same content. These modal expressions don't have the same content as metalinguistic expressions understood the way Carnap and Tarski do. They support different conditionals, different subjunctives apply to them, and so they mean different things by Sellars' own lights. And he says, and yet there's something compellingly right about this story. In particular, the double-barreled Sellars' thesis about modality. This is the expressive role of modal expressions. It's to make explicit features of the framework of using ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, and therefore, in being able to use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, you know how to do everything you need to know how to do to introduce modal vocabulary. That's what Sellars would make of Kant's term a priori. It can be known a priori. You already know how to do everything you need to know how to do in using empirical vocabulary. So there's no particular empirical concepts you need to know how to apply in order to know how to do this. Any one of them will do. There's something fundamentally right about that, but it isn't quite right to say that it's metalinguistic. And he has this very, I think, weak gesture. He says, well, there's more than one way to convey information than by stating it explicitly as the content of something. And gives the example, if I say there's fine weather outside, I've said the weather is fine outside, but I've also conveyed to you the information that I believe that. Now that information I've conveyed, Sellars believes the weather is fine. That means something different than the weather is fine. The weather could be fine even though Sellars never existed or didn't know anything about it. The conditionals are different. If Sellars were struck by lightning or had been dead for 30 years, then he wouldn't believe that the weather was fine. If it was raining, then the weather wouldn't be fine. But it's not so clear that if it were raining, Sellars would believe that the weather was fine. Maybe somebody told him that. Those have different contents, but he says, but you can convey the one by saying the other. And I've suggested that the difference between them is that the inference from Sellars' utterance, the weather is fine, to Sellars believes the weather is fine, is the inference from him saying it. It's from what he's doing. His assertion or judgment or believing of it. From that you can infer that that he believes that the weather is fine. Whereas the inference that it must not be raining, that follows from the content. That is, that's a semantically underwritten inference, whereas the inference to Sellars believes it is an inference from him saying it. It's a difference between inference from the ing and inference from the ed, a semantic inference and a pragmatic inference.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, something related to that. So they're logically different kinds of inferences, right? One is like one could be like a deductive inference, and the other one's, when someone says something, they don't always believe what they're saying. Sometimes they're lying. Sometimes they're trying to deceive. That's more of like, normally, if people are respecting conversational norms, then they say what they believe. So that would be more like an inductive inference, right? At least in this example.
Yeah. Okay. And the way I was putting it is they're subject to different subjunctive conditions.
Right. Yeah.
So they just mean different things.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
And yet there's this relation between them. And I think there was something to this gesture of Sellars, and there's something right about what he said, even though I think it won't do just as it says. But I think the insight that he had was that what he really has a good account of is not the content that's expressed by modal vocabulary, but what you're doing when you assert a modal claim. That when I assert the claim that if you heat a sample of pure copper to 1084 degrees C, it's necessary that it will melt. What I'm doing is endorsing a pattern of subjunctively robust inferences. That's the right way to understand what I'm doing. And that's something you would say in a pragmatic metavocabulary, a vocabulary you use to talk about what somebody's doing when they're talking. So the notion of asserting, for instance, or inferring belong to a pragmatic metavocabulary. They express claims in your pragmatics, your theory of the use of the language, of the episodes that's on the ing side. Not in a semantic metavocabulary, one that you use to articulate the contents that are expressed. And the questions, so Sellars didn't think of it this way, but he had all the conceptual apparatus to do it, including having early on, a few years before, thought that the subject of philosophy was a pure pragmatics of all possible empirical languages. And that's the study that this view would be in. But it leaves him with the question, what's the relation between what you're doing in using a modal expression expressed in a pragmatic metavocabulary and what you're saying when you use that expression expressed in a semantic metavocabulary? And he leaves this question open. We want to know not just what you're doing when you use these things, we want to know what you're saying when you do it. He says, because you're doing this, you shouldn't think that you're describing anything. You shouldn't think there's a descriptive content. But if we see that there's all this space between what's expressed in the pragmatic metavocabulary that says what you're doing and what's expressed in the semantic metavocabulary that says what you're saying, well, how do you know that there isn't also descriptive content, that you aren't also describing in some sense? And I want to say there's good reason to think that there is descriptive content, that you are representing the world as being a certain way. There is a reason not just to be a modal expressivist, but there's reason to be a modal realist as well. Anyway, this is the problem that I think, though he didn't put it this way, that led Sellars to be unsatisfied with where he'd gotten in this essay. And I believe that he always wanted to solve this problem and get an account of modality that he could be happy with, and he just didn't know what to do next. Never did, and he never wrote about modality again. So 30 years he thought about this and didn't make enough progress to write something else on it. So what I'd like to talk about is what you might do next. First of all, why you might want to be a modal realist also and say, oh, well, there also is a descriptive function being performed here. It's a unique kind of descriptive function. It can't be descriptive or representational in the same sense in which ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary is, because there is this essentially metalinguistic dimension to it. In asserting something using modal vocabulary, you are committing yourself about the proprieties of the use of another vocabulary, of the ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And there's no vocabulary that stands to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary in the relation that modal vocabulary stands to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary is not metalinguistic. In saying that the thing is copper, I'm not doing anything or saying anything about the use of some other expressions. But the claim is there's something essentially metalinguistic about to understand what you're doing in making a modal claim. You have to think about what you're committing yourself to as proper for the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. So we can't see them as descriptive in the same sense. But can we say anything about a second-hand descriptive role that these expressions can play in virtue of playing the first-hand expressive role that what we can say in the pragmatic metavocabulary about them tells us? Analogy to keep in mind. Suppose you think that in making first-hand use of normative vocabulary, what you're doing is expressing some sort of attitude about them. In the most reductive version, expressing a pro or a con attitude when you say you ought to do that or you ought not to do that. This is the so-called boo-hurrah expressivist picture of normative vocabulary. Well, we should think of the parallels here. That expressivism could be a great theory about what you're doing when you say what somebody ought to do or what they're permitted or obliged to do, and still not tell us what you're saying when you say it. Since we don't have a general understanding of the relationship between those, maybe the right way, I think it is the right way to understand what is right about expressivism of the C.L. Stevenson or Alan Gibbard or Simon Blackburn sort. I think that's the right thing to say, to think of their insight as an insight into what you're doing when you make first-hand use of these expressions. I mean, parenthetically, I don't think you're expressing that sort of an attitude. I think you're endorsing a pattern of practical reasoning. Indeed, I think when you talk about what somebody desires, you're endorsing a pattern of practical reasoning. I mean, there's a sense in which that's an attitude, but it's not just a boo-hurrah attitude. So in chapter 4 of Making It Explicit, I described the inferential role that I think, expressive role that I think ought is playing. But that's still, this is still sort of an expressivist picture. But if one can make progress on the modal front, sort of understand how there could be a second-hand descriptive role, how we could make an inference from what we can correctly say in the pragmatic metavocabulary to what you ought to say in the semantic metavocabulary. You can say what you're doing? Can we say what you're saying? If we can make progress on that in the modal case, we can hope to make progress on it in the normative case as well. I think Sellars knew that he had just the corresponding problem on the normative side. Remember his claim, the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. That's a way of talking about how you're taking a normative stance about the goodness of an inference in making a modal claim. That's what he means by it. But he sees the parallel between these cases. And I think we can make some progress on this. Now, however it is in the normative case, I think there's a real reason for us to think that there's a descriptive representational role played by modal vocabulary. Well, David Lewis certainly thinks you're describing how things are when you say what's possible and what's necessary, and has a view about sort of how you're describing the world. That view isn't making helpful contact with the pragmatic metalinguistic expressivism that Sellars is giving us, but anybody who is moved by the possible worlds picture is thinking, well, this is how we have to expand the world so that we can think of modal vocabulary as describing it. Not just one world, it has to be all the worlds that we're representing to do it. But I think the following three modally realistic claims are right, that some modally qualified claims are true. Newton's law, F equals ma, for instance, that has unnecessarily in there. It has that force. Well, if it isn't true, things like that are true. That there are true statements about what would happen if. And the modally qualified claims that are true state facts. That, I think, is an analytic claim. A fact is a thought that is true, Frege says. Thought in the sense of a thinkable, not something thought. Ing ed here. And some of those facts are objective in that whether they're true or not, whether they are facts or not, is independent of our discursive practices. At least some of them were true before there were any discursive practitioners. And here in the chapter of my Sellars book, I have an argument I'm inappropriately proud of that I'll just mention, which is one of the great late 19th century mathematicians, Emmy Noether, has a general theorem about symmetries and laws. There's a certain sense in which it's the fundamental mathematical structure of 20th century physics that says the invariability of laws of nature over time is another way of stating the law of the conservation of energy. Those are just two manifestations of the same thing. To talk about the laws of Newtonian mechanics not being different at one time rather than another is another way of saying that energy is conserved. I'm not going to explain that but it's an interesting thing to explore why that is. But then I take it that if you think that Newton's law wasn't true before there were discursive practitioners, you're committed to violations of the conservation of energy. That is, you're committed to fundamental principles of physics being false. Now there are sort of reasons from the bleeding edge to think actually energy isn't conserved in the classical sense, but they're pretty much irrelevant to these considerations. Anyway, this is probably Not a very important argument. I just like it. So I'm going to mention that it's there. But, if you think they're laws of nature, if you think that the sorts of counterfactuals that fundamental physics endorses are true, then there's got to be some representational or descriptive dimension to those subjunctive conditionals that state those facts. Only somebody who is really in the grip of a philosophical theory would want to deny that. Well, if there's no epistemic way to talk about how we could know that, that would be a reason to, but that's not the ideal equilibrium to come to. So what I think is needed to take on board the Sellarsian insight, and so to solve the epistemological challenge that empiricism makes to modality, and if not justify the ways of God to man, at least entitle ourselves to enter the heaven that the four waves of the Modal Revolution have opened up to us, is to say something more about what it is to describe or represent, what describing and representing are. So that's what I want to do in the second half. Why don't we take our 15 minutes now, come back at the half hour, and I'll talk about what we can do beyond what Sellars has done with the notion of description in terms of a space of implications.